She knows my work better than I do. Did I say all that? Wow, okay. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. Yeah. And for the care with which you work through materials. I also want to thank one other person this morning. That is my former student, my colleague, my friend, my teacher, and in the course of my preparation of these lectures, my pastor. She's been caring for me, supporting me, Danielle McCrae, who many of you know. She is, for any of you who've had her courses, you know that she's the future of what I call extreme homiletics. If you haven't had one of her courses, you should have one of her courses. So thank you for all you have done. Feedback, I send her things, this and that. One more time, please. And helping us since we've been here. We really appreciate it. Let me begin with another piece of crime fiction. Even better, let's begin with what many consider to be the very first modern detective story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe. As I noted yesterday, Poe wrote many tales of the grotesque, as he even entitled some of them. These tales are unsettlingly mysterious. They are ominous and threatening, often inspiring a kind of visceral terror. Many of you have probably read The Fall of the House of Usher or The Mask of the Red Death. Interestingly, however, Poe is also considered to be the inventor of the modern detective story. Really? These stories he called tales of ratiocination. In them, the detective uses uncanny reason and analysis to solve a crime and restore order. It's almost as if the tales of ratiocination are the polar opposite of the tales of the grotesque. In Murders in the Rue Morgue, however, the detective story actually employs the grotesque, though in a deeply disturbing way. I'll spare you most of the gory details. Suffice it to say that a mother and daughter are brutally murdered late at night in their fourth-floor bedroom. As Poe's amateur detective Auguste Dupont, it's hard for somebody from Arkansas to say that. As the amateur detective states, the murders involved an agility astounding, a strength superhuman, a ferocity brutal, a butchery without motive, a grotesquerie in horror, absolutely alien from humanity. What's more, the facts of the case lead nowhere. There appears to be no way a murderer could have gained access to the room where the murders took place. There's no apparent way the person could have escaped. There's no way anyone would have had the strength to do what was done. Well, to make a long story short, following many, many pages of ratiocination, Dupont concludes that it was not a human who committed the murders at all. It was an orangutan who had been brought to the city from Borneo by a sailor. The orangutan had escaped, climbed up the side of the building through a window, committed the grotesque murders, and left by the same route. The murder is solved, the orangutan is captured, order is restored. If only it were that simple. But it's not. Warning. Some of what follows is ugly. I don't even like having to talk about it. But we can't talk about the grotesque without looking at the ugly side of the grotesque and the way it is used. And friends, we are living in some very ugly times. And we've got to name some things. We've got to name some things. And Poe lets us see how far back this goes and how it continues. Poe's story was written in 1841 in Philadelphia, where Poe had lived since 1837 or early 1838. The abolitionist movement was growing, and racial tensions in the city were high. There was anxiety among whites about the intermixing of the races. In addition, there was concern over the growth of black wealth and status in Philadelphia. For the anti-abolitionists, black people were becoming arrogant and challenging the social hierarchy. Sexual and economic anxieties merged to create volatile racial conflict during the 6 years Poe was in Philadelphia. In 1838, for example, one of the largest anti-abolitionist riots occurred in the city. Pennsylvania Hall had been built by abolitionists as a center where people of different races gathered for free discussion and conversation. But the grand building was depicted by anti-abolitionists as a place of unbridled extramarital passions between black men and white women. So in May of 1838, a mob burned the building to the ground as the authorities looked the other way. This kind of racial tension is the context of Poe's story. And numerous scholars agree that Murders in the Rue Morgue is a coded story in which the threat of the criminal black man, particularly his threat to white women, is depicted in the figure of the orangutan. Poe was drawing on popular caricatures of the time that depicted black men as primates, as well as on popular myths that orangutans in particular desired human women. According to some, Poe was actually inspired by separate Philadelphia newspaper accounts of a Negro murder and an escaped orangutan. So in the words of literary scholar Leonard Cassuto, Poe conflates the two into a darkly colored ape who viciously kills white women. The black man in the story becomes literally non-human. And the story creates, in Cassuto's words, a mood verging on panic in which all black men are suspect. Here, the restoration of order involves the capture and control of the non-human one, the animal, the ape, who threatens the white order of things. And Poe's move is doubly significant. Not only is the black man turned into a non-human figure, so is the criminal. The two are conflated, as they have been ever since, from convict leasing to mass incarceration. And all of this is the consequence of fear and anxiety on the part of those in power. It is a result of changing times when the white population sees its status threatened and seeks to reassert what it views as the normal order of things, the normal hierarchy of being. As I said yesterday, popular crime fiction does many different things. And what Poe's story does, I want to suggest, is weaponize the grotesque. Weaponize the grotesque. The grotesque becomes a powerful ideological weapon. Remember, the grotesque involves mixing categories. In the grotto, it even involved mixing human and animal categories. But while the grotesque, as I suggested yesterday, is theologically disruptive in important ways, it can be used as a dehumanizing weapon. Those in power employ the grotesque to denigrate people who are different from them in order to reassert their power and reinforce social hierarchies. They can use the grotesque to scapegoat groups, projecting their own frustrations onto them and blaming them for the problems in the larger society. Using language that turns human beings into animals is one way of doing this. Using language that turns them into things is another. Using caricature, the freakish exaggeration of certain body parts, is yet another. And this use of the grotesque occurs during times of transition, when change feels threatening to those in power and fear and anxiety are prevalent. In particular, the weaponized grotesque, or what Cassuto calls the racial grotesque, has appeared when ideologically constructed whiteness and white supremacy feel threatened. Poe's story is thus not just an historical curiosity. The weaponized grotesque has been employed throughout history against countless groups, in addition to African Americans, Native Americans, Japanese Americans during World War II, Jewish people, immigrants, LGBTQ plus people, disabled people. You know what I'm talking about. Indeed, many of you here today know this reality far better than I do, and much more personally. We all know how even Barack and Michelle Obama have been depicted. And think of the charge of bestiality leveled at LGBTQ plus persons. Or the president calling women pigs and a black woman a low-life dog. Or a radio host calling protesters at the Kavanaugh hearing screaming animals. And of course, there's the president's language for immigrants. They're animals. They're aliens. They're infesting our country like vermin. So their children are put in cages. Social psychologists even have a term for this: animalistic dehumanization. In addition, people get turned into things. The president tweets about a flood or infestation of immigrants. Human beings become a natural disaster. Churches turn LGBTQ plus persons into issues to be debated. Persons are not issues. Every day in the news recently, we have been reminded of the way women have been treated as things, objects. Women still have to claim, we are people too. People in prison are reduced to numbers. They become things, so those of us on the outside need not engage their humanity. That's been going on for generations. During the period of convict leasing that followed slavery in the United States, for example, black people were imprisoned on trumped-up charges. They were then leased out to companies as interchangeable, disposable tools in the service of industry. They were literally worked to death. Slavery by another name, it's been called in a Pulitzer Prize-winning book. The practice continues today in for-profit prisons, which are growing. In for-profit prisons, human beings become commodities, sources of profit on an accountant's ledger. And of course, things don't have feelings. They don't have human emotions. So immigrant families seeking asylum can be separated from each other. Children can be torn from their parents without a twinge of conscience and without a plan for reuniting them. The same was assumed of slaves, who also endured repeated family separations. People in prison, whom we often forget about, are also separated from their families, not only by plexiglass and bars, but often by very great distances. The dehumanizing, weaponized grotesque, used to create fear, anger, and disgust at the targeted group, is one of the most important rhetorical tools for maintaining a threatened white, male, heterosexual, and unfortunately at times Christian order. Amidst our shifting cultural landscape, Much political rhetoric today is shaped by an explicit reassertion of the weaponized grotesque. The rhetoric has always been there, but it's often been more coded, more deniable, like in Poe's story. But in recent years, the grotesque has been openly reasserted. And as social psychologists are demonstrating, the use of dehumanizing political rhetoric can be effective. It can shape attitudes toward the targeted groups. Demetria Martinez is a poet, a novelist, a social activist. If you don't know her work, I encourage you to look into it. She's one of my heroes. For many years, she's been an advocate for refugees and immigrants. In one of her poems, Upon Waking, Martinez depicts the inevitable consequences of the weaponized grotesque, and she points us to some responses. She writes, "For Amadou Diallo, shot 41 times by police officers as he reached for his wallet, New York City, 1999. In a dream after your death, I stood on the rocky shores of an island. Dark-skinned people, young and old, pressed against boulders as helicopter gunships took aim. I cried out at a wall of wind, 'No! Stop! They have histories.' But it was too late. The soldiers were acting in self-defense against the sudden move. A people firing a round of stories that might have opened hearts, locked down as the lids of caskets." As Martinez reveals, the consequence of the weaponized grotesque is death. Literal death. Once people become things or animals, their lives don't matter. They can be killed, mowed down without a second thought. They can be suffocated, shot point blank, shot in the back as they run away, and there will often be no charges, no convictions. But simultaneously, Martinez suggests, there is death among those who weaponize the grotesque, those who do the killing. It is what some have called the death of the moral conscience, or the death of the moral imagination. Their hearts are locked down as the lids of caskets. In the midst of this chaotic, destructive swirl of death, Martinez calls preachers to the necessary response: no, stop. Preachers are called to interrupt the weaponized grotesque that leads to death. No, stop. These people are not animals. They are not aliens. They are not issues. They are not infesting our country. They do not belong in cages. No, stop. Then Martinez goes a step further, suggesting direction for resistance among preachers. No, stop. They have histories. They have stories that might open hearts. Listen. Listen. The first step of resistance is to declare unequivocally, no, stop. I wish I heard that more from pulpits. And then we hear and share stories that reveal the humanity of those who have been turned into animals or things. This humanizing is always possible because, as I've noted, the grotesque is always unstable. The weaponized grotesque can never fully stick because the combined categories of human, animal, or human thing are incongruous. They are unsettled. Indeed, the grotesque itself subverts the attempts to use it to objectify or animalize human beings. The humanity of the victims can never be erased. It's always present, always reasserting itself. As Cassuto reminds us, the grotesque by definition is liminal, in between, unsettled. It cannot be hardened into stone. We talked about that last night. And that, Cassuto suggests, is at least a little offer of hope, as he writes. The grotesque is a threat to the system of knowledge by virtue of its liminal position within the system. This liminality demands resolution. For a human being caught between the categories of human and thing, the pressure will be exerted toward a return to the human category. For that's the only choice that offers the possibility of resolution. It's thus no wonder that the efforts to dehumanize often grow more and more intense as the humanity of others reasserts itself. It takes more effort to maintain the weaponized grotesque. But it is precisely into this unstable situation that we are called as preachers to speak a counter rhetoric. And this rhetoric often takes the form of counter stories, counter histories. Stories that resist and subvert the false patterns of the weaponized grotesque. This is a refrain we hear from oppressed groups throughout history. The refrain of reclaiming their humanity. Whether Sojourner Truth actually spoke the phrase or not, there's some debate about that. "Ain't I a woman?" echoes through the generations. And from Frederick Douglass to the sanitation workers in Memphis, the refrain sounds, "I am a man." And some people listen, and the caskets of their hearts are opened. And so it goes, with groups struggling to resist the weaponized grotesque and reclaim their humanity, and preachers are called to join that resistance. In 1852, about a decade after Poe's detective story, another important work of popular fiction was published. It was a counter story to Poe's. I will argue that it was really a sermon, combining as it does biblical texts and story and direct address to the reader. Indeed, it is one of the most effective and controversial sermons in U.S. history. The novel was addressed to the dominant white majority, to those responsible for dehumanizing others. And it sought to counter the weaponized grotesque that undergirded the system of slavery. I'm talking about Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, as you might imagine, I'm a little bit uneasy discussing this book. It's an unsettling novel, filled with contradictions and incongruities. On the one hand, in Stowe's ugly context, the book was audacious and scandalous. It was a powerful piece of protest fiction, written out of Stowe's outrage over the Fugitive Slave Act. It was a bold and courageous word, much more daring, I confess, than most of the sermons I have preached. I rarely preach out of outrage. I wonder why that is. She did. On the other hand, as we all know, the novel is troubling in so many ways. At times it is patronizing, or maybe better, matronizing toward black people. At points it infantilizes African Americans. It contains generalizations about race that are cringeworthy. And there are some good reasons why Uncle Tom became a dismissive epithet for a passive, servile black person. It's an unsettling book, written in very unsettled times. out of outrage in the moment. But I want to listen to the novel for a couple of reasons. First, along with other works of sentimental fiction, it is very important in the history of preaching. Homileticians need to deal with it, and deal with it honestly, and deal with it in some detail. But we have not done that. What better time than in the Beecher lectures, right? And second, in the novel, Stowe seeks directly to resist the weaponized grotesque. That really is the focus of the book with all its flaws. We preachers can learn both from her resistance and, this is important, from her limitations. Indeed, I've had to confront and confess some of my own failings and limitations as I have considered hers. First, the preaching piece. Through her novels, Harriet Beecher Stowe, along with other popular women novelists of the 19th century, influenced the preaching of her day and the field of homiletics, although their influence has been largely ignored in our field. In some ways, I would argue, Stowe indirectly shaped preaching as much as her father, Lyman, and brother, Henry. Maybe it should be the Lyman and Harriet Beecher Stowe lectures. I don't know. You mentioned this last night. Unable to preach from pulpits themselves, they weren't allowed there. Popular women novelists became what historian Mary Kelly calls preachers of the fictional page. Indeed, Stowe herself wrote, "It is as much my vocation to preach on paper as it is that of my brothers to preach viva voce, voice." In this vein, Ann Douglas said of Uncle Tom's Cabin itself, "It is a great book, not because it is a great novel, but because it is a great revival sermon aimed directly at the conversion of its hearers." Others have noted that parts of the novel provide a classic example of the Jeremiad, a political sermon inspired by the strong, condemnatory, judgmental words of the Old Testament prophets that was well known in New England at the time. Like Stowe, other popular women novelists preached through their pages. They also did some interesting homiletics. They critiqued, sometimes hilariously, the abstract preaching of their day that was divorced from the realities of life, especially the realities of women's lives. As Stowe herself wrote of Samuel Hopkins in her novel, The Minister's Wooing, "The only mistake made by the good man was that of supposing that the elaboration of theology was preaching the gospel." And those kinds of comments run through these novels. A woman will be sitting in the congregation listening to a sermon, trying to outline all the points in the A, B's, and doctrines and going to sleep. There's really something. We need to listen. In place of this abstract doctrinal preaching, the women novelists sought to edify their readers through stories. And often women in the novels became the real preachers, offering a fresh and relevant gospel to hurting people while the men went on tediously elaborating their doctrinal points, one after another from their pulpits. Cultural observers of the time recognized what the novelists were doing. The writer and critic Henry Tuckerman noted the role of popular fiction in spreading the gospel. In the pages of journals and the verses of poets and the favorite books of the hour, he wrote, "We have homilies that teach charity and faith more eloquently than the conventional Sunday discourse. They come nearer to experience. They are more the offering of earnest conviction, and they therefore enlist popular sympathy. Similarly, though more pejoratively, of course, Mark Twain noted that the gospel of Christ came filtered down to 19th century Americans through the despised novel and not from the drowsy pulpit. In addition, as historian David S. Reynolds has argued, the popularity of these novels was one important influence on the turn from doctrine to narrative in the 19th century pulpit. While there were many strands, including black preaching, that contributed to the emergence of pulpit storytelling, popular homiletical novels played a significant role. Phillips Brooks, for example, highlighted this influence in his Beecher lectures. He approvingly recognized that the competition of print has interfered very much with the monotonous reiteration of commonplace abstractions in the pulpit. And in his lectures, Henry Ward Beecher himself defended the edifying use of stories over the discussion of intricate details of doctrine. So, when I hear the term new homiletic used to describe the turn to inductive and narrative preaching in the 1970s and 1980s, I want to say, really? New homiletic? Don't limit the field to traditional pulpits. Some people weren't allowed in those. Go back and listen to some women. Read Harriet Beecher Stowe and Susan Warner and Elizabeth Stewart Phelps. The new homiletic was not so new after all. And these women, many of them relegated to the backwaters of the literary canon by a male literary establishment, are some of its unsung heroes. I've been wanting to say that for a long time. I feel so much better. So, Harriet Beecher Stowe preaches through Uncle Tom's Cabin. So now we're going to do a little sermon analysis. You know how those go. First you have the positive feedback, then there's the but, right? You preachers have been to these classes, you know. Preach your sermon, positive, but. So if I may borrow something Rachel Maddow frequently says, stay with me. Through her sermon, Stowe seeks directly to challenge the weaponized grotesque embodied in the political, legal, and economic system, and that's her term, the system of slavery. Outraged, Stowe shouts in the best way she can, no, stop. She tells stories that seek to open human hearts locked down as the lids of caskets. And in many ways, she succeeded. When Stowe met Abraham Lincoln in the White House in 1862, as Dean Sterling noted last night, the president is said to have greeted her with the comment, "So, you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Even if Lincoln didn't literally say that, the statement did apparently reflect widespread popular opinion. People were moved by Stowe's sermon, and her homiletical tactics are worth examining. In resisting the weaponized grotesque, she not only seeks to humanize those who have been labeled inhuman, she also proclaims Jesus' solidarity with the victims of the weaponized grotesque. When Uncle Tom's Cabin was first advertised, the subtitle was not Life Among the Lowly. Rather, the subtitle was The Man That Was a Thing. The Man That Was a Thing. That subtitle captures Stowe's purpose. She sought to humanize people who had been turned into things. That emphasis threads throughout the novel on virtually every page. And while she employs several strategies to accomplish this purpose, her primary way of doing this is unfortunately very relevant today. Over and over and over again, so that her readers couldn't possibly miss what she was saying, Stowe depicts the wrenching separation of slave families, especially the separation of mothers from their children. And she graphically portrays the horrifying consequences of these separations. She creates a collision of narratives between the value of the domestic family, which was at the heart of sentimental fiction, and the inhumane breakup of families by slave masters. It is a good homiletical move. Remember that phrase, collision of narratives. It's a good move for interrupting the status quo. One of the central plot lines involves the slave Eliza, who risks her life to escape to Canada with her son Harry, rather than being separated from him. We also read about slave mothers who commit suicide when their children are taken away from them. One woman jumps off a ship with her child, so they both drown rather than being separated. Nothing sentimental there. On page after page after page, Stowe depicts the wrenching emotions that these separations create in families of human beings. Emotions that humanize people who were treated as things, as property, as chattel. Stowe regularly cites Scripture against this evil, challenging the preachers of her time who used the Bible to support slavery. Not unlike some people are using the Bible today to support all kinds of weaponized grotesque. And she speaks directly to her readers in the second person to force identification with her characters. As Eliza begins her midnight escape with her son Harry, Stowe writes this: "If it were your Harry, mother, or your Willie, that were going to be torn from you by a brutal traitor tomorrow morning, if you had seen the man and heard that papers were signed and delivered, and you had only from 12 o'clock till morning to make good your escape, how fast could you walk? How many miles could you make in those few brief hours?" I think about the immigrants coming with their children. As in much sentimental fiction, there are tears, many tears, and they are meant to elicit readers' tears in order to move people to empathy and to action. Christine Smith, the homiletician, she's written a whole book, says preaching moves from weeping to confession to resistance. Weeping to confession to resistance. Maybe Stowe was trying to do something similar many, many years ago. Empathy, Stowe recognizes, is one antidote to the weaponized grotesque. Empathy that may create outrage and lead to active resistance. In rereading the novel, I became intrigued by some other tears I had read about. 4 centuries earlier, at the beginning of the slave trade in Portugal, the royal chronicler Zorara shed tears while watching the auction of slaves who had just arrived in the country. Zorara's Tears, as some of you know, is the title of the opening chapter of Professor Willie Jennings' book, The Christian Imagination. Zorara's tears, too, were shed as he witnessed the separation of slave families. Those tears, too, 4 centuries earlier, acknowledged the humanity of people grotesquely treated as things or animals. But as Jennings demonstrates, theological dogma, unquestioned colonialism, and a racial scale of being prevented Zorara from ever acting on those tears. He could not join and embrace those others. The slave trade just went on. Apart from confession and resistance. Tears alone are never enough. Remember that. As Toni Morrison put it in her foreword to The Bluest Eye, people can take comfort in pity rather than engaging in serious self-interrogation. People can be touched, but not moved. Stowe and Zurara remind us of contemporary tears. Tears shed at our southern border by parents and children separated from each other. We've heard the audio of that crying child, right? We've seen the photos. And there were also the tears people shed when they saw images of asylum seekers torn from their children. Tears not just of sorrow, but tears of rage. Interesting, isn't it, that the separation of families finally caused people to wake up and take notice of the treatment of immigrants in this country. Just like Stowe's depiction of the separation of slave families caused some people to wake up, to open their hearts, and resist the weaponized grotesque that undergirded the system of slavery. No, stop! They have histories. They have stories. Stories, Stowe reminds us, can humanize people, and open hearts lock down like caskets. And all of us who preach know that. We've told those stories, I'm sure. But, Stowe's novel also reminds all of us that telling these stories is never simple. We preachers need to recognize that as well. Whenever people different from ourselves, in whatever way they are different, and this is not just about race, I'm not just talking about race. Whenever people different from ourselves become victims of the weaponized grotesque, we confront the same challenge Stowe encountered. How do we tell humanizing stories? Stowe's novel highlights the difficulties preachers face. Stowe reminds us of a kind of double bind we are always in. Our congregations need to hear stories that humanize victims of the weaponized grotesque, but it is very dangerous, even at times inappropriate, to tell another person's story. There's the danger of false patterns, the danger of misrepresentation. There's the hubris of presuming to speak for someone else, much less for another group. There's the problem of simplistic or sentimental sympathy that simply ends with tears. There is, in short, the problem of telling another person's story from our own perspective, as Stowe does by telling slaves' stories from the perspective of an omniscient white narrator. Her gaze is empathetic. Yes, give her credit, but it remains a white gaze. And that's the preacher's dilemma. Whenever we seek to tell another person's story, we cannot escape our own gaze, even with the best of intentions. Stowe was outraged, and she had to speak, and there were very few outlets from which she could speak, including the pulpit. So she did what she could do. She preached the abolitionist cause to countless people through her novel. And many people, including prominent African Americans, were thankful she did. But she also oversimplified and misrepresented the stories of slaves in disturbing ways, as James Baldwin has passionately noted. As a result, the trajectory of the novel didn't just humanize, it also created some unfortunate, demeaning stereotypes. I wrestle with this dilemma myself. And thinking about her struggle has reminded me of confessions I need to make. A number of years ago, I co-authored a book entitled The Word on the Street. In the book, my colleague Stan Saunders and I shared stories of homeless people whom we had encountered on the streets of Atlanta. We did not take this task lightly. We had spent years on the streets getting to know people. We had eaten with them. We had slept on sidewalks with them numerous times, listened to them, learned from them. And we wanted their stories to be told, and we could tell them. But looking back now, I'm not so sure. Who was I? Look at me. Who was I? A comfortable, tenured professor to tell their stories. How many false patterns did I impose on them? How often did I use them to support my own theological points? The words of Lucille Clifton's poem, "Why Some People Be Mad at Me Sometime," trouble me now. Why some people be mad at me sometime? They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories, and I keep on remembering mine. That's the preacher's dilemma. Other people's stories, other people's memories are really not ours to tell. But we are called to resist the weaponized grotesque, and sharing stories can be a very effective way to do that. We cannot escape the dilemma. And we will never get it just right. But we can be careful. We can listen deeply to others before we ever speak. We can get to know people and invite them to edit and approve not only the stories we tell, but the way we use them. We can be self-critical about the ways in which our perspective inevitably colors the stories we tell. We can confess that in our sermons. But best of all, we can at times turn over our pulpits. How about that? Turn over our pulpits to others so they can tell their own stories, provide their own descriptions, share their own memories. Even if some people get mad sometimes. Stowe doesn't simply, however, tell other person's stories. At a deeper level, she's trying to tell the story of Jesus. By making Tom a Christ figure, she proclaims Jesus' solidarity with the victims of the weaponized grotesque. Interestingly, as Jennings details, Zurara inadvertently does exactly the same thing 4 centuries earlier. Praying in response to the slave auction, Zurara interrupts the colonial narrative and figures the experience of the slaves through the passion narrative. In Jennings' words, Zurara joins the slave body to the body of Jesus. Those treated as property, chattel, actually become Christ figures. As Jennings notes, however, Zurara's Christology is neither salvific nor life-giving. It leads only to death because Zurara cannot even imagine the full implications of what he is doing, and he doesn't follow through. But I'm intrigued that at the origins of race, as Jennings puts it, Zurara inadvertently hints at the humanizing, Christologizing moves that an abolitionist in the United States will use centuries later in seeking to end slavery. It makes the theological path, the complicity between theology and racism that Jennings traces, seem all the more tragic. Stowe also joins the slave body to the body of Jesus, though she does so intentionally rather than inadvertently. Tom, the man that was a thing, becomes the Christ figure, whose passion narrative begins when he is sold to the cruel master Simon Legree. Now, I confess that much of Stowe's depiction of Tom does not resonate at all with my own understanding of Jesus' work. But I have to note, if I'm honest, that at the end, Tom is killed because he defies his master. He's not a purely passive Christ figure. On more than one occasion, Tom refuses to follow the demands of Legree, asserting his own humanity, Tom will not act against his conscience, and he is beaten more than once for his resistance. Finally, after encouraging the slaves Cassie and Emmeline to escape, Tom refuses to reveal where they are hiding, even though he rather tauntingly tells Legree that he knows exactly where they are. Tom could have avoided death if he just sort of obeyed the master, betrayed the women. But he is defiant. He literally saves Cassie and Emmeline. Tom is a stronger figure than he is often given credit for being, at least at the end. And Stowe makes this link to Jesus clear. Along his Via Dolorosa, Tom sees a vision of one crowned with thorns, buffeted and bleeding, but also crowned with glory and splendor. Tom has his moment of doubt, asking if God has forsaken him. He remembers Jesus' last days and repeats Jesus' words, "Into thy hands I commend my spirit." He forgives his enemies, proclaims a gospel of love, and people are changed by his death. Stowe's move here really is scandalous. What an offense it must have been to join the slave body to the body of Jesus. According to the norms of many of her readers, the combination of slave Christ, thing Christ, must have seemed grotesque. Talk about destabilizing pairings of opposites. Stowe subverted binary categories and created disruptive incongruities. No wonder many people who benefited from the binaries absolutely hated the book. Stowe's novel actually takes us back to the Alexamenos Graffito, which I mentioned yesterday. Jesus becomes the object of animalistic and objectifying dehumanization. Tom is the Christ figure, yes, but Jesus is refigured here as well. Jesus becomes the victim of the weaponized grotesque. And that is a profound insight into the gospel. For surely that was the case for one who was crucified. The person became a non-human thing, an object, a means of deterrence, something that to be laughed at on the cross. As in the Alexamenos Graffito, Jesus becomes the divine, human, non-human one. Jesus himself becomes the man that was a thing. Stowe declares Jesus' solidarity with those who have been dehumanized. And in that way, she seeks theologically to resist the weaponized grotesque, to say in God's name, no, stop. It's a bold move. It's a bold move. But despite Stowe's insights, she presents us preachers with a troubling theological challenge. Christ figures are dangerous. They bring with them theological assumptions. They can inappropriately impose a theological pattern on another person or another group who may want no part of it. I have done this. I did it in the Word on the Street. And that's what happens in the novel. I think it's one reason the book is so troubling for many of us. Stowe imposes a theological pattern on Tom's suffering. He becomes a figure of redemptive suffering. His suffering saves others. Because of her particular theology, that's the way Stowe can hold Tom and Jesus together. But in doing so, she reminds us that the theological gaze can be as dangerous as the racial gaze, which raises important questions for all of us preachers. Is it appropriate for Stowe to declare a slave's suffering to be redemptive? Is it appropriate for me ever to pronounce an oppressed group's suffering to be redemptive? Is it appropriate for any of us to make that claim for another person's or another group's suffering? I don't think so. It would be like telling Gregory Orr after he killed his brother, give thanks Give thanks. Your suffering is beautiful. It will save others. Christ figures, even with the best of intentions, can simply be another way to impose dangerous false patterns. We need to handle them with care. In his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, James Cone takes us more deeply, much more deeply, into the complex relationship between the story of Jesus and the weaponized grotesque. Lynchings are the extreme American grotesque. We can't talk about the grotesque in this context without naming that. People, human beings, are treated as animals or things, and a spectacle of death carried out with the grotesque incongruities of horror and laughter, repulsiveness and celebration. Strange fruit. And the fears and justifications that drove lynchings were the same as those that led to the writing of Murders in the Rue Morgue. It's hard to imagine a more brutal expression of the weaponized grotesque than a lynching, except, Cone suggests, for crucifixion. Indeed, linking the cross and the lynching tree, Cone argues, requires imagination rooted in the realities of experience rather than in theological abstractions. Artists are needed, he writes. Artists are needed for us to see things we do not want to look at because they make us uncomfortable with ourselves and the world we have created. Cone, therefore, does not try to explain or pattern the saving power of the cross. He doesn't try to impose some grand theological shape. Instead, he recognizes it as a mystery beyond human understanding. He doesn't try to untangle or resolve the grotesque contradictions. Rather, he writes, the cross is a reminder that the world is fraught with many contradictions, many lynching trees. And for Cone, this disruptive juxtaposition of the cross and the lynching tree is itself the scandal of the gospel. He should speak for himself. Here's what he says. When American Christians realize that they can meet Jesus only in the crucified bodies in our midst, they will encounter the real scandal of the cross. For the real scandal of the gospel is this: humanity's salvation is revealed in the cross of the condemned criminal Jesus, and humanity's salvation is available only through solidarity with crucified people in our midst. Faith that emerged out of the scandal of the cross is not a faith of intellectuals or elites of any sort. This is the faith of abused and scandalized people, the losers and the down and out. Any genuine theology and any genuine preaching, he concludes, any genuine theology and any genuine preaching of the Christian gospel must be measured against the test of the scandal of the cross and the lynching tree. Cone doesn't try to explain the contradictions of a grotesque gospel. Rather, he sets us down in a U.S. sanctuary, like the one in San Salvador that I mentioned last night. At the front, there is a beautiful, colorful cross, and there are wonderful images of hope. But on the back wall are the Stations of the Cross. Only now, in our context, they are graphic images of lynchings. In between, facing those images, sits the pulpit. And from that pulpit, where we can never, ever avoid the weaponized grotesque, we preach. No! Stop!